Welcome to the Benson Wealth Podcast. I take complex financial and economic topics and make it accessible to the everyday listener. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Benson Wealth Podcast. My name is Drew Benson. I am the president and founder of Benson Wealth Management and a senior wealth advisor with Raymond James. I'm also the co-managing partner for True North Wealth Management Group, which is a platform for independent wealth advisors. I'm a former macroeconomist, and I'm currently a certified financial planner and wealth advisor. So today I have Dr. Shawn Ritenour back on the podcast. Dr. Ritenour holds a PhD in economics, and he is a professor of economics at Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania. So today, Dr. Ritenour and I are going to talk about 6 very common economic myths. I hope you enjoy. Dr. Ritenour, great to have you back on the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm always happy to be here.
It's good to see you again.
That was great to see you.
So school's back, right?
Oh yeah, we're back, and we're in the third week already. So we're plugging right away.
Very good, very good. I hope you're not taking in. There's no mercy on your students. I hope the tests are still very difficult.
Yes,
because they were for me, by the way. Yeah, they were hard for me.
I remember that. Yes, I'm trying to maintain the standard. Absolutely, and
you are maintaining the standard.
We're trying to whip them into shape. We're trying to get them to rise to your level.
Yeah, right. I hope they perform a little bit better on some of the exams than I did.
Well, you remember, see, that's the problem. We didn't have exams, remember. We have Knowledge Festival.
Oh, I know better. I'm sorry.
There's celebrations of learning.
That is correct. And your quizzes were intellectual hors d'oeuvres.
That's right. Yes, just sort of whetting the appetite for the buffet.
I love it. I love it. Well, because you said an exam is like something you go to the doctor for. It's something really unpleasant.
Yes, exactly. And that's not the way we do things here.
So we're gonna have a knowledge fest with you today, my friend.
Oh, very good.
On the common myths that surround economics. So let's get into before we get into the 6 myths. Let's talk about economics as a discipline. And I think one of the misconceptions around economics is that it's this hard, scientific, mathematical. Not that there isn't a place for statistics or for using numbers to justify certain economic arguments, but I think a lot of people view it more a part of the halls of the science departments than necessarily the social science departments. So let's start with some basics for 5 minutes, Dr. Ritenour. What is economics at its most basic level?
Yeah, economics as a discipline, I would say, is a social science, but then it sort of, what that means hinges on what we mean by science. A lot of professional economists and people in the intelligentsia, people in the media, they think that in order for economics to be a science, it has to be something like a physical science or a natural science. It has to be sort of a positivist. It has to be driven by hypothesis testing, or it has to be analyzed within a mathematical framework. So we posit economic relationships as mathematical functions. Consumers try to maximize utility function subject to constraints. Producers try to maximize a profit function subject to constraints. And it's all very quantitative, all very mathematical. And then we can arrive at certain conclusions or hypotheses that when then we test with data, and we sort of proceed bit by bit the way they think that say physics does or biology does. But
sure.
The difference between those sciences and economics as a social science is the object of our study. We're not studying a life force or just organisms. We are not studying inanimate objects that are reacted upon by outside forces. The object of our study in economics is the human person making choices and economizing resources and trying to improve their life through human interaction, through exchange. And because of that, good economics really is about looking at the nature of action, the nature of purposeful behavior, people applying means that they have or obtain to achieve ends according to the ideas that they have linking the means and ends, and therefore that has implications for how we do economics. Humans do not behave as if they are lightning fast calculators of pleasure and pain. They don't believe. They don't act like quantitative maximizers, and they don't act like animals. Right? They act like humans that make choices, and therefore, once we understand that, we can then derive economic principles such as the law of marginal utility, the law of supply, the law of demand. We can derive them from the fact that humans do engage in action. So we can deduce true economic principles from the implications that humans engage in purposeful behavior. And that's the way. I mean, that's the way we approach economics at Grove City. That's the approach that the so-called Austrian school tends to embrace, and we do so because we think it. On the one hand, we think it's more realistic, and for that very reason, because the economic principles that we are deriving are deduced from realistic human action, the laws themselves are more reflective of reality, so that when we use these laws as a guide to public policy, we are, in some sense, advocating policy that's not going against economic reality. And some of the time, not all of the time, but other economic frameworks that are very quantitative and very positivistic, sometimes they will arrive at conclusions that are at best irrelevant from the perspective of real human action. And then, and again, those conclusions wouldn't necessarily be so damaging, but then those conclusions are taken for true principles that are then used to justify economic policy that actually is destructive. Right? And so having a more realistic, humane economics leads to, I think, economic policy that actually promotes human flourishing rather than works against it.
And look, I do think there's a place for statistics within economics. That said, as a counter, though, I think it's really easy to try to take human nature and position it as a data point.
Yeah.
And there's a reductionistic, I think, mindset there where we try to portray humanity as a specific sort of vacuum scenario that isn't in accord with reality. And what I always enjoyed about your classes and what I appreciate about the way in which you view economics is I think it's a much more holistic and broader conception of humanity and a richer diagnosis of who we are as human beings. We're dynamic, we're willful, we have preferences. It's not always about just money either. Like, we're driven by a variety of different incentives, and it's not always monetary in nature.
Right.
And I appreciate the richness of it, but I think a lot of confusion comes in when people think economics. They usually just think, X and Y charts, and they think supply and demand functions, and they think of all these other sort of rigid statistical ways. And I'm not saying that's not a part of the equation, but that's a flavor of economics, and economics as a whole is actually really rich and dynamic and philosophical, even at times sociological in nature. That that's one of the reasons why I fell in love with economics in the first place, is that it was more than just an equation.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That, I mean, sure, there's a role for statistics as long as we understand that statistics, by their nature, we're talking now in the realm of economic history, which is different than doing economic theory. And history can be very very educational. It can illustrate and give us a lot of wisdom, and so it's helpful in that way. But we don't necessarily, I would say that the validity of our theories is due to who we are as people and the laws of logic. And then the history can be used to illustrate these principles that have occurred over time, in real time.
You can contextualize it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
One of my problems with data is it gets decontextualized. I'm actually writing an article for my blog right now, and it's about how when the yield curve inverts, it's been a pretty powerful predictor of recessions.
Yes.
But when you peel the onions of the layers of the onion back on that analysis, there's a lot of different reasons why the yield curve will invert, and one of the assumptions is that yield curve inverts because investor preferences turn dour. They think there's a recession on the horizon, and so they bid up and they want longer-term bonds. They want safety of income. So, like, the theory fits, right? Like, because every time the yield curve seems to invert, there's a recession. It's happened 9 out of the last 10 times. However, as I explored the research a little bit more closely as a financial practitioner, what I found is that that assumption that it's always predicated on fears of recession is actually not true at all. Yeah. That yield curves historically have inverted for very different reasons. But therein lies some of the problems with statistics, because we already go in with an assumption about this is what human nature means, and therefore we make these bad logical syllogisms of if this happens, then this happens, when if you step back and start to put something like the yield curve or any other sort of topic they're looking to study, when you contextualize it in history, what I found, at least exploring the yield curve, and I won't go off on it too much, is that I found a very different narrative when you actually add in a level of contextualization, and statistics often avoids context outright, which is why models can be very wrong.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, there's no such thing as a brute fact, right? The facts always have to be interpreted, which means we always have to come to the facts with some theory to explain what's going on. And, it could be a theory that, well, whenever this happens, a recession must be on the horizon. But that would be one way to try to explain it. But the other way might just say, okay, what are the reasons why the yield curve would invert? And then what's going on right now? And does what's going on right now, does that look like
match
a recession? Yeah, exactly.
Does it match prior historical precedents? And if it doesn't, then we're in a different scenario.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get into the 6 myths today.
Sure.
So, first myth is that consumer spending is a great measure of health of the economy. And I hear this particularly in the financial media, and just with your pretty run-of-the-mill economists within the financial world, is one of the measures that they look at is, hey, the economy's doing great. Consumer spending is really strong.
Yeah.
So that's my first question to you is that true? Is consumer spending necessarily a great measure of the health of an economy and its productivity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say not necessarily, for sure. I can imagine a situation where it would be an indication of a strong economy if increased consumption would be the result of increased real income. In other words, someone either real income is increased, that allows them to consume more as well as save more. So consumption spending, it goes up, and so that would be a sign of shall we say, some economic health, some economic progress. On the other hand, there are many different ways and different reasons why consumer spending could increase, which doesn't reveal a strong economy. It's not a manifestation of a strong economy. Case in point, right? You could just have a large amount of monetary inflation or government income transfers from the hands of savers to the hands of consumers, which then would boost consumption, would make GDP look good, but in reality works against a strong economy. It could be a situation where people in general in a society become more present-oriented, so they just want to consume more. They don't want to save as much. That would allow them to live higher on the hog for a short period of time, but once those consumer goods are consumed and no consumer goods are being produced sort of on the back end to replace those consumer goods, then people will find out that, our economy's not doing so well at all. The main fallacy with this idea that consumption drives the economy, or consumption is the path forward to generate prosperity. In some sense, shall we say, a consumption that would be an indicator of economic progress would be increased consumption resulting from increased production. That what drives the economy is increased production. So if we can consume more. But if we consume more without saving enough to replace our capital base, for instance, we don't maintain our capital gets consumed, our productivity will decline because we'll have fewer machines and tools with which to work when our productivity falls. That means our real output will fall, our real standard of living will ultimately fall. So what really drives the economy is production, right? We need, before you can consume anything, it has to be produced. So if we want to enjoy more consumption in the future, we have to produce more now. We have to make the decisions to save and invest. And so a set of policies that would try to stimulate consumption for the sake of boosting the economy is short-sighted at best and destructive, really, in the long run.
So one of the to segue here, one of the, I'd say, theories is that recessions are a byproduct of a lack of sufficient demand. That we have a sufficient amount of goods, that scarcity is not as bad as people say it is, and that when we and by the way, the term animal spirits is thrown on a lot in my world. I hear people say it almost daily. So then it's like, well, the reason that we're in a recession is that people just stop consuming. So what do you say to that? Is that true? Is a recession a lack of sufficient demand?
No, I think that's a fundamental myth sort of you get from what I'd like to call vulgar Keynesianism, right? That the idea that what drives the economy is spending per se, and therefore, if we have a recession, there's a lack of spending per se. This view sort of aggregates all of the economic everything and treats the economy as if there's one good, output, and it doesn't matter what we spend it on. We're always spending on sort of output, and so stimulating spending would be the thing that matters. But in reality, of course, an economy progresses when producers are producing goods that people actually want. And so it does matter what we spend our money on. And so when there's a recession, the problem is not a lack of spending. The problem is producers have been encouraged to produce the wrong things compared to the preferences of people in the economy. And especially, they've been encouraged to embark on production projects, not all of which can be completed with the amount of savings and capital investment in the economy at any given point in time. And so it's sort of like a home builder, a carpenter has been encouraged to build a building with a foundation that's so large they don't have enough bricks to complete the whole building. And therefore, the building doesn't get completed. In like fashion, entrepreneurs can get led astray to produce goods and set out on projects that not all of which can be brought to completion because there's not enough actual capital in the economy because there's not enough savings. And when that happens, somebody's got to liquidate. Some production process is just going to come to a halt. Some project will be partially completed, but there's not enough actual demand of that particular good to make it worthwhile. And so what you have happening is there's sort of a mismatch. There are consumers that would like to have more of one good, but there's not enough of that good being produced because resources are directed to other places in the economy, and the demand is not sufficient for those producers to earn profits. And so you have a fundamental discoordination of capital within the entire economic production structure, and therefore a good number of entrepreneurs earn losses, and that's what causes the recession. So it's not a lack of demand; it's simply a mismatch between. It's a cluster of entrepreneurial errors. It's a mismatch between the decisions of the entrepreneur and what people in society actually want to consume.
So resources have been allocated in the wrong places.
Exactly.
And therefore projects like, I think we talked about this last time you were on the podcast, Dr. Ritenour, that a lot of resources were allocated towards the housing market and we overproduced.
That's right.
I think it was like 5 to 8 million homes.
That's right. Yeah.
But
exactly.
Ironically, we're in a reverse situation where we have a 5 million home shortage and resources, they're out there. They're still scarce, but they're out there. Yeah. But an insufficient amount of resources have been allocated to something like housing, and now we have a housing shortage. And so this, I think this is an important thing to highlight. And I agree with you. I do think consumption can be reflective. We're not saying it can't reflect the health of a society, but oftentimes it can be a false signal for all the reasons that you just pointed out.
Yeah,
let's talk about
absolutely. That's right.
Let's talk about the next myth. So inflation, and I hear this a lot, inflation is caused by businesses, particularly greedy businesses. So what say you, Dr. Ritenour? Is that true?
Well, the short answer is no.
Price inflation, to be clear.
Yeah. The short answer is no. I mean, the idea that, prices went, the rate of increase in the consumer price index in the 1970s hit 10%, or did something similar year over year, say in 2021, 22. The reason that happened because all of a sudden there was a spike in prices. Why? Because there was a spike in greed, as if the corporations were doing just fine. They were living more saintly until something took over. That's a little that
animal
seems,
spirits.
Yeah, exactly. That seems fanciful to me. No, I mean, sure. At any given moment, corporations, single proprietors, anybody would prefer to be able to charge the highest prices possible that the market can bear, because in so doing, that would increase their income. If they sell their product at a higher price, they can actually sell their product at a higher price. They get higher incomes. That allows them to satisfy more of their ends. They can pay their workers more. They can reinvest more into their company. They can afford to buy more consumer goods for themselves and their family, right? And so, any given moment, the entrepreneurs want to charge the highest price possible. Of
course they do.
So the question is, what allows them to charge higher prices en masse? What allows not just, say, the producer of apples, but the producer of apples and bananas, and the producer of smarty phones, and the producer of automobiles, and the producer of tennis shoes? What allows all these people to charge higher prices? Well, it has to be because the demand for all these goods has increased relative to supply. Well, what could possibly allow that to happen? How could more people want to buy more of all these goods all at once? There has to be more money in the system. There has to be more dollars, right? There has to be more dollars. And so it should be clear if people are serious about investigating what's really behind price inflation, it's clear that it's the money producers, right? In our case, it's the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve that oversaw. I mean, it's not like a mystery. You just go to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors website and look at the monetary statistics, or go to Fred at the St. Louis Fed and look at the money statistics from M1 and M2, and just look what happened to the money supply from say 2019 to 2021. And you had this massive increase in the money supply, and
about $5 trillion.
Yeah, surprise, surprise. Prices went up. Prices started to go up as people began spending all of that new money, and that's the link, right? You increase the money supply. People have an they get to hold more money than they really want to hold. They don't need to hold that much money, so they go out and they spend it. They increase their spending, driving up the demands for producer goods, and businesses, when they drive up the demand for, or the consumers drive up the demand for consumer goods. Businesses drive up the demand for producer goods. So the prices of consumer goods increase, the prices of land, labor, and capital goods increase, and so the overall price level of overall prices, the entire price structure increases. That's price inflation, and that's result of monetary inflation. It's not the result of entrepreneurial greed or corporate greed or anything like that.
Do you think fiscal policy plays a role as well when governments engage in massive spending projects?
Yeah, I do. But even that, it depends on how it's funded, right? So, if the increase in government spending would be matched dollar for dollar with an increase in taxation, without an increase in the money supply, well, then you're probably just rearranging demand. So there'd be an increased demand for whatever goods the government wants to buy, but there would be a decrease in demand for the goods that the taxpayers aren't able to purchase because of higher taxes. And so that wouldn't necessarily result in overall prices. It would definitely reallocate goods and wealth towards the government class. But which is often the case, and it certainly was the case, it's been the case for decades, certainly since, 1913.
Since COVID.
Well, since COVID, but going clear back to 1913.
Go way back, of course.
So when the government spends money, where are they going to get the money? They're not taxing it dollar for dollar. They're borrowing it. and they are borrowing a significant amount of money from the banking system, which is bankrolled by the Fed. So it's called monetizing the debt. So whenever the government spends more money and it's funded by debt monetization, by monetary inflation, well, then yes, then that's a key proximate source of higher prices. But even in that case, it's because the Fed is playing ball with the government.
Mm-hmm. And did that happen, say, in 2020 and 2021 between the last two administrations, where they essentially, because I think it was at least $4 trillion between the Trump and the Biden administration combined.
Absolutely.
And then you throw in another $5. Yeah.
And what was interesting about that, too, is that there was not just, there was increased government spending, but there was also a significant spike in the amount of dollars held by the U.S. Treasury in its bank accounts. And so
balance sheet?
Yeah. Well, the U.S. Treasury, they have their deposits at the Fed.
Oh, the Treasury. Yeah. Sorry.
And so the Treasury allowed its account balances to increase. In other words, they were their amount of cash holding was increased significantly for a period of time, and I think that's one reason why the amount of price inflation wasn't as high as the rate of monetary inflation, because there was there's an increase in demand to hold money by the U.S. Treasury, and they were holding significant amounts of money for a period of time, and then they were able to they've let it sort of eke out over time, which is another reason why, say, prices haven't fallen prices haven't come down as much as you would think when the money supply has actually shrunk over the last, I don't know, say 2 years or something. So the Fed is trying to help. The U.S. Treasury, the government, is trying to help the Fed manage the situation, but they're still, in effect, managing the misallocation. They're not fixing the problem.
Yeah, that makes sense. One other really quick question is, now, typically when the Fed is expanding the money supply through monetary base, and for a listener, monetary base is essentially those things. Can you explain really quick, just so that people, because you'll explain it better than me, can you quickly explain what is the difference between monetary base and, say, something like M2?
Yeah, thank you. So the monetary base is, as the name implies, for the base on which the money supply rests. And so the monetary base would include the total currency that exists in the economy plus commercial bank reserves that are held by commercial banks like First National Bank, PNC Bank, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
And
JP Morgan.
And then the commercial banks use that as sort of a financial basis upon which to make loans. And since we engage in fractional reserve banking, just as an example, for every dollar that a bank might hold in their reserves, let's suppose that they lend out $10. So they create $10 and loan it out for every dollar they hold on reserves. So you have sort of a 10% reserve ratio. So as the monetary base increases and decreases, bank lending can increase and decrease. And so when the Fed injects reserves into the banking system, that raises the monetary base, and then that provides a financial basis for banks to expand credit even more and since create more money. And so in terms of M2, or say M1 would include is M1 and M2 are different official measures of the money supply.
Sure.
M1 is a more narrow one,
a little more liquid, right?
That's right.
Money market accounts, and
yes, and
banking, savings accounts.
Yes. So M1 would include currency. It would include checking accounts. It now includes savings accounts, which it used to not. And so they've actually broadened the definition of M1, I think March of 2020. But then M2 includes all of M1 plus time deposits, like small time deposits. So the large, like if you go from M1 to M2, it's M2 is a little bit broader in terms of what is counted in the money supply. I think between the two of them, M1's probably more accurate in terms of what money actually is. But in any event, the monetary base is the base upon which M1 and M2 sort of rest, if you will.
So one of the questions, and the reason I wanted to sort of lay this foundation is that usually when people hear that the Fed has opened the printing presses, someone like me would say, well, here comes inflation.
Yeah.
That's not always the case, right? Like if you look at the way in which the Fed engaged in monetary policy in 2020 versus the way the Fed engaged in monetary policy in 2008, we had aggressive inflation. It hit 9.1 in June. The CPI was 9.1 in June of 2020. We didn't see that type of inflation coming out of the financial crisis.
Yeah.
My understanding is that just because monetary base expands doesn't necessarily mean that it leads to M2, which circulates via velocity, which therefore creates price inflation. Please correct me if I'm off, because this has been something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. Do you see those scenarios?
Yeah, I think your intuition is basically correct. What the Fed has direct control over is the monetary base. Mm-hmm. They don't have direct control over how many dollars through credit expansion and loans banks can create, right? Mm-hmm. Or that they do create. So in 2008, we had a situation where there's so many banks that really didn't know what the value of the mortgage-backed securities really were. They didn't know what really the value of the hard assets were, and they were very nervous. And, of course, big-time banks were going under. And so there was a great incentive to take the money that was injected in the monetary base and just hold on to it as an asset to protect themselves from other asset classes collapsing. And so what banks didn't do, at least initially, was take those new reserves and immediately begin loaning out money on top of that. And so you didn't have the significant increase in the money supply like we did in 2020, where the Fed injected money into the banking system, and they immediately began buying more loans. And on top of this, I believe the Fed also began buying just assets in general. I mean, I think they began to expand their purchases beyond even the Treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities, and in some sense, then were injecting money directly in new money directly into the economy. And so that's a significant reason why price inflation was higher in 2021 compared to 2008, 2009.
Because I think a naive perspective is someone who's saying, I actually just read this the other day in an article, it's like, well, the Fed doesn't really create inflation because look at 2008. There's plenty of periods. And it seems to me, I mean, first of all, in 2008 and 9, the credit markets had completely seized because, to your point, like if you look at Lehman Brothers as a for instance, when they were evaluating, I just have done a lot of research on this. When they were evaluating their balance sheet for their mortgage-backed securities and their credit default, not their credit default swaps, but their collateralized debt obligations, third parties were coming in and analyzing it, and many were saying that they were overvaluing it by 2x.
Yeah.
And they had that literally had half as much capital reserves on their books than what they thought that they had.
Right.
And so, to your point, the credit markets had completely seized up, which is why the Federal Reserve and the Treasury was so paranoid about everything, is they realized wow, the banking system is literally collapsing before our eyes, and thus that's an environment where people are not going to lend.
Yeah. But
in 2008 and 9, we weren't dealing with a meltdown of the financial system. It was a different scenario where I think banks felt. They felt at least comfortable enough that they can lend out.
Sure.
Because this was an exogenous sort of shock from COVID-19, et cetera. But I wanted to dispel that because I think people say, well, the Fed doesn't really create inflation. But it's like, well, I think the way in which inflation manifests itself, back to what we were talking about at the beginning, it needs to be contextualized. What is the backdrop of what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also important to recognize that when we talk about causing inflation or not, it's always relative. It's somewhat counterfactual in the sense it's always relative to what would have happened if the Fed hadn't acted, right? So you could look at, say, absolute price levels in 2008, 9, and 10 and say, well, prices went up maybe 1%, and they engaged in significant quantitative easing in 2008 to put all these reserves in, and so they maybe increased the monetary base by a significant amount. but prices didn't go up. So the Fed doesn't create price. Well, now the question is, though, what would the price level have done if the Fed wouldn't have injected that amount of money, right? Because if those banks would have been if those banks would have been left insolvent, and some of them would have collapsed and liquidated their assets, there would have been massive decreases in the money supply. Then prices would have fallen, right? And so as a result of the actions of the Fed, prices were still kept higher than they would have been otherwise. So there was serious relative price inflation compared to what it would have been if the Fed didn't act. And so the Fed were keeping prices artificially high, right?
It's a great point.
It's again, but it does get back to your idea of your point of being able to contextualize the statistics within sound economic theory and what was actually happening.
Correct. No, those are amazing points, because it's. I don't think it's hard to imagine a world where there was pretty steep deflation, post 2008 and 9, right? Yeah. And I think that was something that the Fed at the time, right or wrong, they were combating. Yeah. All right, myth number 3: price controls are an effective way to control inflation. So we're hearing this on the campaign trail right now.
Yes.
And I'm not a partisan person. I'm not talking about candidates here, but it's something that's floating. This was attempted under Nixon. This was attempted under the Herbert Hoover administration, I believe, in the early 30s. So is it an effective way, Dr. Ritenour, to actually curtail inflation by actually enacting price controls?
No. Price controls are an effective way to create shortages and surpluses, depending on the type of price controls. So prices are going high. We've been hearing rumblings that certain candidates are going to be promoting price gouging laws, passing laws that a company can't raise their price by more than 25% in 1 year, something like that. Well, let's suppose that those laws get into place, and there would be significant increases in demand for some project, for some product, so that the actual market price would say go up by, let's say that the average you can imagine it happening. Say the price of gasoline on average goes up to $5 a gallon.
Sure.
Because of things going on in the economy and elsewhere in the world. Suppose there's a massive escalation in the conflict in the Middle East that ends up embroiling a lot of oil-producing countries, and the price of gas, say, goes up to $5 a gallon or something.
Shortages on oil.
Exactly. So let's see. Well, people have to have gas, and they can't afford $5 a gallon. We're going to put a price at $3.50 a gallon. What is that going to do? That's going to increase the quantity of gasoline demanded, and it's going to decrease the quantity of gasoline supplied. And it's definitely not going to provide an incentive to produce more gasoline. And so you're going to have more people wanting to buy gas, and there's gas to be supplied, and you're going to get shortages. That's why we had these type of shortages back in the 70s. Yep. My father worked in the meatpacking industry, and it would have been probably 1974-ish, 72, 73, when Nixon put his price controls for a brief period on certain consumer goods like processed beef, dressed beef. So the price of steaks and the price of hamburgers were frozen. They called it the meat freeze, actually. Well, what they did not do was put price controls on livestock, on live steers that were coming into the meatpacking plant. And so the price that the meatpacking plant could sell their finished product was capped with the price ceiling, but the costs that they had to pay continued to escalate. And at some point, the meatpacking plant recognized we can't profitably operate. We can't continue to
We're going to shut down.
Exactly. So they shut down. So my dad lost his job, and he had to go to western Nebraska to help some ranchers put up hay for a week on end. He would have to leave the house, and he'd go and be away from the family for a week, and then would come home on the weekend and then go back for a week. And thankfully, wisdom prevailed after only about 4 weeks. The Nixon administration realized this is not solving any problem.
A disaster.
And so they lifted the price controls, and everything got back to normal, and Dad got his job back at the meatpacking plant right away. So to me, it's funny. One of the reasons I think that people are prone to accept these economic fallacies that have been demonstrated as fallacies again and again and again is that they haven't lived through an actual historical episode of this, right? I think one of the reasons why young people find it fine dabbling with socialism is that they don't know enough history about what a real socialist economy must be like, and therefore they think that they can sort of play around with it, and we can get the good things about socialism without the bad things about socialism. Likewise, I think we haven't had a period where there is a significant sort of time of really bracing price ceilings on goods in general in this country, I should say, really since the 70s. And so the vast majority of people, and certainly all young people, don't have any living memory of what it was like to have shortages in grocery stores for basic items because there are price ceilings put on these things. And so, again, this would be an example of say a faulty understanding of economics leading to economic policy that's disastrous, right? I mean, it won't even achieve the goal of the politicians. The politicians say we're going to put price ceilings on these goods so that more people can afford these goods. But it won't allow more people to have these goods. It will cause fewer people to have these goods because there'll be a massive shortage for these goods. And so price ceilings don't even accomplish the ostensible end that is stated by the people calling for these price controls.
Yeah, it doesn't. And to boot, and your father's a great anecdote that it cannot. Not only will it not actually control the prices, what'll happen is that people will lose their jobs too.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
So there will be a shortage of goods. There will be a shortage of jobs.
Yeah.
And if you're a business, ultimately it'll just shutter you.
That's right.
So you're going to get out of business the way that the meatpacking plant. It's interesting just thinking about living, historically. For the longest time, I never really heard much criticism. Going back to the Fed for a minute, I never heard really much criticism from a lot of mainstream individuals on Fed expansionary policies, or even any. There was some critique from the political parties about fiscal discipline, but now that we're getting walloped in the face with inflation, it's come down a bit. But it hadn't been until the early 1980s, since the early 1980s, that we've actually experienced meaningful inflation in this country. Now I'm watching a lot of mainstream people call for fiscal responsibility, and never thought I'd hear it from,
right.
And people starting to really call into question the aggressive expansionary policies of the Federal Reserve.
Right.
And to your point, it's because they're living it.
Yes.
Yes. They had to go to the grocery store for the last few years.
Yeah.
But back to the controlling inflation, this idea that we're going to put on price controls on grocery stores which have margins of less than 2%, it's not going to work.
Right.
What you're going to find out is that Kroger and Shaw's, and we have a Market Basket's popular up here. So Market Basket, they might shut their doors if we go down that path. I do also wonder if it's rhetoric, if it's an appealing thing to say, but if there's really actually going to be any sort of meaningful policy proposals with whoever might be the next president of the United States.
Right. I mean, I think that in some sense it has to be more rhetoric than anything, because even if they believe the rhetoric and they put some of these price controls in place in their general price controls, the negative consequences would be so obvious so fast that
politically damaging too.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point. It would be so bad politically for whoever's doing it. I mean, the government can get away with a significant amount of intervention and regulating the economy because the costs of those interventions and regulations get accounted for in the price calculus system, right? So it makes everything more costly, but those costs show up as prices, and so economic decision makers, even in a hampered market economy, can make decisions that are best for them given the elevated costs due to the government intervention and controls. But if the government intervenes with price controls, then the prices that they use to calculate profit and loss are necessarily false, and it becomes much more difficult to rationally organize an economy. And so it's always, if the government's going to intervene, it's always better for them to intervene through regulation apart from price controls, because the price controls just completely undercut the ability of entrepreneurs to effectively make decisions about what's profitable and what's not.
Yeah, great point. So let's move on to the fourth myth, and I'm going to phrase it a couple ways. So the price system only benefits the wealthy. I would say another way that you would hear this is that profits are really a system designed to enrich the greedy of society. And even if it's not some concerted, cigar smoking backroom conspiracy, that even if people believe it's an organic system, inherently profits really are for the greedy, and it's the greedy that exploit that system. What do you say to that?
Well, I think that the profit system, or should we say in the profit system, people are rewarded for serving others more successfully than anybody else. Right? In a free society, in a free market, nobody can force other people to buy from them. Nobody has a gun to their head, so you must buy from me. If I'm Kroger, you say you have to buy from me. You can't buy from Winn-Dixie, or you can't buy from Walmart. You've got to buy from me. And Walmart can't put a gun to your head, so you've got to buy from us. You can't go to Kroger or wherever. So in a free market, the firms and the entrepreneurs that earn profits, they do so precisely by providing other people what they want at the lowest possible prices. And so if someone earns a high profit, it is a signal that they are serving others very effectively. And so that doesn't just benefit them. Yes, they benefit from higher profits. Of course they do. But the only way that they can get these profits is by doing things that other people want them to do. Right? And so the idea that the profit system just rewards the greedy, that the earning a profit has nothing to do with greed. A profit has to do with serving other people. Now, are there entrepreneurs that are driven by greed? And of course. But one of the beauty of the price system is, even if that is true, even if the entrepreneur is the most greedy capitalist pig, the only way he could satisfy his end of higher profits is by serving other people. But in an interventionist regulatory system, it's certainly possible of getting large amounts of income, not by serving other people, but by doing what the government wants you to do, right? But by getting special government privilege, by getting government subsidies. And so that in terms of comparative systems, a free market price system is the best system to ensure that the majority of people in the society have their preferences satisfied compared to the alternative.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a while I was thinking about how for a while I had an allergy and had to carry around an EpiPen and epinephrine. I believe, I don't want to misspeak here, but I believe that someone had a bit of a monopoly power on epinephrine, and they were driving the price up. Well, part of the reason is because they had sweet arrangements with the government where they were able to have essentially a cartel on it, and that's what people don't realize. There wasn't a market for it. Yeah. Like, you don't have that type of price gouging in a system where there is sufficient competition. Yeah. And it's often used, as controversial as this may sound, this is one of the reasons why I can be very critical of the patent system. Yeah. Patents, by default, can create highly monopolistic systems. Sure. And when you don't have competition, then what happens is, sure, I mean, I'll make as much money as I possibly can, right, if I'm a really greedy person. Yeah. And if there's no competitor, then they can engage in price gouging. That's right. So I'm not denying that price gouging or excessive profit seeking occurs, right? But the solution to this is to make sure that our markets have a sufficient amount of appropriate competition, so that I have to fight with all the advisors in the area. There's lots of them, right? Yeah. I have to fight for people's business. I spoke to a woman this morning about bringing her on, and listen, Sure, I'd love to charge 5%. Now, I don't think that's ethical to charge 5%, but I have to keep my fees reasonable because otherwise I will get outbid.
Yeah.
Even if I wanted to be greedy, there's something that would hold my worst instincts in check. And,
That's right.
and for that, I think we should be really grateful for the price system.
That's right.
The price system is a mechanism with which people's best instincts actually can come out, but it's not positioned that way.
That's right. And in some sense, I mean, even in a monopoly system, the drive for greed is not completely unregulated in the sense that even a monopolist can't charge the highest price he'd like to charge, because at some point people are simply not going to pay the price, right? If I give them, if I have a monopoly on basketballs or something, I say, "Oh, I've got a monopoly. I'm going to charge $1 million a basketball." Well,
right, yeah.
I'm not going to sell nearly as many as I would because there are lots of people that flat out couldn't afford $1 million to pay for basketballs, and so even a monopolist is constrained by demand, as long as you don't have the government forcing people to buy from them.
It's like a Bond villain,
Yeah, that's right. Yes,
we're going to charge billions.
That's right. It'd be like we could call it the basketball finger.
Yeah, there you go. All right, the next, I got two more myths for you, and this is a big one. This is another one that we're hearing with the political class. So tariffs protect domestic workers. So particularly, I mean, you live in Pennsylvania. Yep. I obviously lived there too for a while as a student.
Yeah.
There's this idea that if we put in place things like steel tariffs, we're protecting steel workers. So is it true? Do tariffs actually protect workers?
I would say that in the short term, tariffs could benefit the workers in industries that are protected, but any protection is going to be a short-term thing. So if, let's suppose that, just take the steel industry as an example, if you put steel tariffs on or tariffs on steel, imported steel, making foreign steel more expensive or as expensive as domestically produced steel. So American firms will not import as much steel. They'll buy from American steel producers. Of course, increased demand for an American steel factory would tend to benefit that factory, benefit the people who are working there. But if it raises profits, say in an American steel industry, that would tend to stimulate increased investment in the American steel industry, which would eventually lead to an increase in the quantity of steel produced, yes, but that would also stimulate an increase in the demand for factors used to produce steel in America, driving up the prices of labor in the steel industry and driving up the prices of, say, iron ore and the furnaces and everything else until the costs would rise to such an extent that there would be no more profits. In other words, the costs of production would adjust upward to this tariff situation, in which case there's no more profits to be had because of this thing, in which case the benefits from these tariffs would be somewhat temporary in terms of support, or in terms of benefiting the entrepreneurs in that industry. They would not be able to earn perpetual profits because of higher tariffs. But at the same time, or that's only looking at the steel industry, at the same time, every manufacturing firm in the United States that needs to use steel would be forced to pay a higher price for steel because they would not be able to take advantage of less expensive steel production that may happen overseas. And so, and then everybody who would want to buy a product from that's made with that American steel would find it more difficult. Fewer of these products using steel would be able to be produced, and therefore the supply of these goods would be lower, so the market price would be higher. And therefore, even if a tariff would provide a short-term benefit to a protected industry, the vast majority of people in the country would be harmed because the amount of consumer goods that they'd be able to afford would be less because they would end up paying higher prices for all these consumer goods.
There's a great article that Don Boudreaux and Phil Graham wrote in the Wall Street Journal. It's probably been a year to 2 years now, and they looked at the impact of steel tariffs, and what they found is that I think it was like the mid 30s, call it 35. For every steel worker that was protected in the short term, there were about 35 other manufacturers in the United States, 35, proportional amount of workers that use steel as an input that were harmed.
Yeah.
And so when we say we're going to protect blue-collar jobs, it may sound great on paper. It might be great rhetoric for the campaign trail, like price controls are great rhetoric for the campaign trail.
Yeah, you're right.
But it actually might be harming a lot of the very people you're seeking to help. It definitely hurt farmers because, acquiring capital goods, tractors, et cetera, became more expensive.
Yeah.
And that hurt farmers, particularly in the Midwest. So people don't always think through the downstream impacts of any of these myths, but particularly this one. They don't think of the downstream impacts of how it can actually hurt many of the very people it's seeking to protect or care for.
Absolutely. And, I mean, I'm sort of biased here, but that's one more advertisement for good economic education, that you understand some of these things if you learn good economics. But if you don't know good economics, you're left with sort of the superficial analysis that you get from the talking heads on TV and podcasts that are less informed than you, shall we say. One counter, and I try to steelman myself now and again. One counter is that it could be used, though, as a geopolitical warfare. Yes.
And And so I will say for some major politicians, I don't necessarily think their instincts are that they desire protectionism. I don't know. I don't know what's in the true minds of these people.
Yeah.
But the idea is, well, we're going to use tariffs as almost like an economic Cold War to try to get our trading partners that are putting up tariffs. We're going to use that as a geopolitical weapon. What would you say to something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely possible, and I think there you'd have to say that economics really doesn't have anything to say about
that's fair.
The political aspect of it, but what economics can say is that, look, you want to accomplish this through tariffs, okay, it's your political prerogative, but you should know that this is not going to be costless. Like, if you try to accomplish some political end through tariffs, geopolitical end through tariffs, there's going to be a cost, and you need to include that in your calculus. It's not just going to be a win-win. There's going to be losses here, and you have to assess, is the benefit, the geopolitical benefit, greater than the economic cost.
So I appreciate you saying that, because I think it's really tempting, because economics describes so much in the world around us. We think it'll answer every question, and economics in its purest form can't necessarily answer that question, because there's multiple factors that we're balancing here with geopolitics. One other point I wanted to make about tariffs before I ask you my last question is, ultimately, it's a tax.
Yes.
That's all a tariff is. It's a tax on imports.
That's right.
And so one of the things for people to be very aware of is, when you advocate for tariffs, what you're advocating is for tax hikes.
Yeah, that's
so
right.
It's fascinating, because I watch a lot of people campaigning saying that they want to raise taxes, but they're very against tariffs. I'm like, well, it is a tax. Like, maybe you should like it if you like raising taxes.
That's right. And that they can halfway get away with it, because they think, well, it's just a tax on foreigners, right? It's the tax on the foreign producer, but they don't understand why that tax is going to come back to make it's ultimately the American consumer that pays a lot of it because of the higher prices.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that. It's not literally a direct tax on Americans, but it's inadvertently shows up in higher prices, and therefore I would say it's an implicit, not an explicit tax. It
is. But in terms of like superficial analysis, right? That's what the politician can get away for saying, well, we're going to tax the foreigner, and we're gonna help us. But in fact,
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, but in fact, you're exactly right. Economically, it functions as a tax against us, because we're the ones having to pay the price.
Bingo. And I think that gets lost in the rhetoric.
Absolutely.
All right. Final myth for you. The best way to reduce the national debt is to tax the rich. We need to eat the rich, Dr. Ritenour.
Yeah.
So is taxing the rich the way out of our debt problems?
No, for a number of reasons. The most important of which, we can't fund we can't fund the gap by simply taxing the rich. We might be able to significantly reduce the deficit with a one-time tax of the rich, but if you tax the amount of money from the rich that we would need to cover the gap, we'd cover the gap one time, and then the rich would stop being rich, and they would not be nearly as productive, and the entire tax base would begin to shrink. And so this, again, it's like a rhetorical Band-Aid. Sure,
sounds nice,
right? Since there are a lot fewer really rich people compared to the average, of course it's going to sound good politically. People aren't paying their fair share. What is their fair share? And why aren't they paying their fair share? I do think we've kind of got ourselves a little bit in a pickle because ever since 1971, there's been this increased financialization of the economy. So driven by debt and monetary inflation. And whenever that happens, it's not as if everybody's money, stock, and personal cash balance increased all at once. The money gets injected into the banking system through the preferred lenders, and then those preferred lenders get to lend out money to their preferred borrowers. And so certain people get that new money first. And so the people who get new money first are the people that tend to be very close and intertwined with the investment banking industry and the government. And so, yes, there has been a certain increase in inequality driven by, again, the Federal Reserve, inflation, and the sort of financialization of the economy. But it's kind of like how do we respond to monopoly prices? Do we grant the monopoly and then we control the prices? Why not get rid of the monopoly? Why not stop government privilege for a monopoly? That'd be the simpler way to do it. Similarly, does it make sense to in some sense, unless the government wants to generate more revenue through the back door of monetary inflation without actually borrowing more money? In other words, we could provide for significant monetary inflation, boosting the monetary incomes of people close to the money trough, and then we're going to pass a windfall profits tax on the rich that we have created by giving them more money. And so it's like, wouldn't it be better if you wanted the economy to be on a more level playing field, if you wanted the economy to be more just, stop the inflating and allow new investment to be funded by voluntary savings, so then nobody gets special privilege, nobody gets cheap money, everybody gets to borrow money that's actually been saved by somebody else. Then we will see who are the people making the higher incomes and who are making the lower incomes. But trying to tax the rich, again, even in a free society, taxing the rich simply means punishing people who more successfully serve others than anybody else. Mm-hmm. And we wouldn't. I don't know why we'd want to punish them for that. When we tax anybody, we are reducing not only their ability to consume, but we're also reducing their ability to save and their incentive to save and invest, which is required for long-term economic progress. So if I do think we need to reduce the debt and we need to reduce the deficit, but the only wise way to do that is through a reduction in government spending. That if we reduce government spending, then that takes resources out of the hands of government bureaucrats and leaves them in the hands of private, productive entrepreneurs that will actually sow the seeds for actual economic progress over time.
One, when tax rates do indeed get high enough, there's a point at which people do feel disincentivized to actually engage in productive activities. And
Oh yeah,
I don't think the Laffer curve is a perfect description of reality.
Right.
But I think there's got to be some sort of shape from if there's zero taxation in terms of revenues generated for the federal government to 100% taxation, there's got to be some sort of a slope, right,
Yes.
that occurs over like a bell-shaped curve of sorts
Yes.
that occurs over time. Because 100% taxation, you have zero incentive to produce, and therefore zero revenues.
Yes.
And at zero taxation, there's no revenues for the federal government. But this idea that we can increase revenues while indeed increasing marginal tax rates on the wealthiest doesn't necessarily occur.
Yeah.
And there have been some instances in the past where we actually lowered marginal tax rates and revenues increased to the federal government.
Yeah.
So I'm also just not convinced it would even be effective, even if we could extract a lot of wealth.
Yeah.
Maybe one time, to your point, that might have a nice little pop. But as a consistent system, that would not work over the long haul.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And again, just practically from a political economic perspective, if the government is successful in extracting significantly higher revenues, that's not going to go realistically to reducing the debt. That's going to say, "Oh, we've got more money now, so we can spend
naive.
more." It's just going to open the door to more spending. And so,
Correct.
if the government is not willing to get its spending under control, which there seems to be zero effort and even interest,
and both parties, by the way,
absolutely,
both parties,
absolutely.
Like it's so easy for people to lob grenades at the other side,
Yes.
and blame this party for that and this party for something else. And the reality is, there has been zero fiscal discipline, particularly since George W. Bush's administration till today.
That's right, and so until we're willing to actually be responsible with this and actually significantly bring down spending, any talk of reducing the debt or the budget deficit is just whistling in the dark, it seems to me.
Dr. Ritenour, this has been awesome. Thanks for coming on the podcast again.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
If you've enjoyed this content and you're looking for a wealth advisor, or if you're a financial advisor and you're looking to make the jump to the independent side, please message me on LinkedIn, or you can email me at drew.benson@bensonwealthmgt.com. Or lastly, you can call my office at 603-316-2544. Securities offered through Raymond James Financial Services, Inc., member FINRA SIPC. Investment advisory services are offered through Raymond James Financial Services Advisors, Inc. Benson Wealth Management and True North Wealth Management Group are not registered broker-dealers, and they are independent of Raymond James Financial Services. The foregoing information has been obtained from sources considered to be reliable, but we do not guarantee that it is accurate or complete. It is not a statement of all available data necessary for making an investment decision, and it does not constitute a recommendation. Any opinions are those of myself and not necessarily those of Raymond James. Expressions of opinion are as of this date and are subject to change without notice. There is no guarantee that these statements, opinions, or forecasts provided herein will prove to be correct. Investing involves risks, and you may incur a profit or loss regardless of strategy selected.